When it comes to violence, most people think it's a fight or flight situation. You've all heard that term, but actually it's a little more complex than that. And today that's what we're going to go over. What are the responses to violence? So I got to give credit where credit is due. I originally got the concept from this idea for what you're about to hear from Dave Grossman. Dave Grossman is just a fantastic writer in the industry. He wrote a seminal book a while back called On Killing, and there's just a lot of great information on there. If you enjoy some of the material that you're hearing here, Dave goes in depth on a lot of things. A lot of it's military based. He does make some societal, things about how it affects us, video games and things like that. He's been a controversial speaker for quite some time, very well known in the law enforcement community and military circles. He tends to get people outside of those circles a little uncomfortable. One of the things he talks about in his book is the soldier's response, the soldier's options. What are the soldier's options when it comes to, being faced with a threat? And he talks about fight, flight, posturing, he calls it posture, and submit. Those are the four responses that he talks about. And he talks about them as fight or flight basically only being valid in the animal kingdom when it's a different species. And what he talks about here is that with same species, there are these extra two situations where there's submission and there's posturing, and you got to really go in depth on that. So it caused me to write a blog post a couple years ago, and I named that blog post the Four Horsemen of Response, basically looking at the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and for our responses to violence, a human's response to violence against another human. What are we looking at? Well, you're looking at fight, flight, capitulation, and posturing. I put it a little bit differently because of what I want you to get out of this presentation. And so again, Dave was the inspiration, and this application of that thought process is specifically for self-protection and how you respond to a threat. So, okay, we've talked a lot. We're going to start off with fight. We have talked a lot about, when the time to use violence would ever be appropriate. And so our definition of when we would use the fight aspect is being devoid of choice. You've heard me say that millions of times. Devoid of choice means that if you had an exit, you would have taken it. If you had a way to get out of there, talk your way out of it, apologize, use your social skills, you would have already done that. And when all of that is, not there for you, you're devoid of choice, then again, that's when we would use the fight response, because really that's the only way you're going to get yourself out of that situation. So that's pretty clear to us. And I've talked a lot about that in the channel. The next response is flight. And we've also talked about it. The flight is the number one thing that I think people don't take advantage of enough. And that is, you have an exit. You have a way of getting out of the situation that you're in. And the only reason you stay in is because you let ego or some, social aggression keep you there. But again, flight for us is always, the option. You never, if you have the option to leave, then it's very dicey if you choose to use violence when you had an option, especially, legally, they're going to look at that, whether or not you had an option to get out of there and disengage. But sometimes if you have that and you continue forward by using violence, then they're going to look at you as a willing participant. And all of a sudden, your ability to claim self-defense goes right out the window. I'm giving very broad terms here, but I think you understand what I'm talking about. So that's fight and flight as far as we're concerned. And we have talked about that in this channel. What I think is more interesting is the next two. And capitulation. Capitulation really is just submission. And what does that mean? That means the threat is so overwhelming that you freeze, basically. You freeze and you capitulate. You literally submit to the person in front of you. I was talking recently to a former member of the Aryan Brotherhood who got out of prison. I'm going to be doing a interview with him, and it was interesting. He was put in a cell with some other high value prisoners at one point. One of those prisoners happened to be Charles Manson, and what he told me was what I thought was really interesting was the first thing Charles Manson did when this guy came into the area, into that part of the holding cell with the other four, high value prisoners, meaning very well known guys that are in there. The first thing Manson did was come up and lay his forehead right on this guy's chest. That in prison, from what he told me, is an act of submission. First thing that he did, because this guy knew, I got no chance. Charles Manson looked at it, and he was not a brave guy. He's a very small guy, and he quickly submitted. So that's an act of submission. I call it capitulation, meaning you just, regardless of, there's not flight. You're even too scared to run, basically. And you just submit. Okay, that's one use of capitulation. Now, there's another use of capitulation that's very interesting, and you sometimes see it in the animal world. Capitulation, or you can feign capitulation, meaning pretend to submit, to pretend to capitulate. And the reason you're doing that is because you want to be able to close distance, and so you want the predator to come closer to you, or you want him to allow you to come closer to him. Why? Because everything that'll change things in your favor, assuming you don't have a firearm on you or any sort of a distance weapon, is you've got to get on that human body and get to work. And there have been some very good uses of feigned submission, feigned capitulation to lull the predator closer to you so that you can then get that opportunity to injure them. So there's two ways to use capitulation. One is not even a choice. It's just an overwhelming, just possession of your body of fear to where you freeze, and the only thing you do is submit. When other species do this together, like you'll see dogs every so often get together, and one dog will roll over and show their stomach. It shows a very vulnerable part of your body to them, which is showing, hey, I submit, I'm no threat, I'm not going to challenge you, type thing. That, to me, is something that's interesting. Now, in training, oftentimes, especially when you're dealing with a predator that has a firearm or something like that, we've done some really interesting uses of capitulation to close distance. There's ways of doing it. It's very dicey. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's not something you want to have to do, but you can use that effectively. The next one, I'll probably spend the most time on this last one. This is the one that really worries me with a lot of the comments that I get and a lot of, what I've seen over my, almost 30 years of doing this in the industry with people. Untrained people who are socially aggressive tend to rely on posturing. And what is posturing? Posturing is kind of what we see, the loud, the inferring threats. The whole idea of posturing is to run the other person off your territory or pretend that there's going to be some sort of, effective violence done if they don't do what you say. And the problem with posturing is most of the people that employ posturing are those that have zero in the toolbox when it comes to violence, meaning if they get called on their bluff, then they have nothing to fall back on. And it's extremely dangerous. I remember when I was going around to different publishers, I went to Simon & Schuster in New York, and we were selling the woman's book at the time, and Simon & Schuster was taking a look at it. And one of the women I had a female executive in there. She was really aggressive. She was a typical New Yorker. And she was listening to me talk about one aspect of the book. And she just said, well, I don't agree. I think I was talking about how to disengage from a situation. And she said, well, I just don't agree at all. And this is what I do. She talked about a girlfriend of hers who had a guy that was stalking her, quote unquote. And she sat there, and the girlfriend said to her at one point, oh my God, she looked out the bar. She looked out from the bar that we were at there out the window. And she saw this guy, and she tells, her girlfriend, and she wasn't an aggressive person. I guess her friend wasn't an aggressive person, but this woman was telling me, and she was a short woman, and she was just there, but she was a typical New York, executive. She's used to giving orders. She's very powerful in the publishing industry. And she just felt, oh, this is not going to happen. She marched right outside. She got right in this guy's face, told him to go. And guess what? He left. And I sat there and listened to her and nodded my head. So, oh, that's really great. I said, well, I said, luckily, the individual that you did that to was kind of within the social fabric still. He He chose to, take your posturing and leave. And it worked out okay for you, but it's really dangerous because let me show you this. And then I showed her the same video. If you have not seen Tragedy in Rome, I showed that one. So check out my YouTube channel, and you can get Tragedy in Rome. I showed her quickly that video of the woman in Rome who did the same thing, got right in the guy's face, boom, boom, boom. And the guy hauls off and just hits her. Her head hits the ground, bleeds out immediately. It had the effect. She definitely got my message, but I didn't get a book deal with Simon & Schuster. We went on and we ended up going with Rodell. Though I think the woman was a little taken aback and didn't like the idea of thinking that she had been rolling the dice on that situation. And I see people do this all the time. I see people take chances all the time with posturing, and posturing is extremely dangerous. The threat to violence, the threat that you're going to do something and you have nothing to back it up is really, really dangerous. And I see a lot of people relying on that in this day and age. You see it with a lot of these quote unquote protesters that are out there. You can tell they've never been involved in violence before or anything, because as soon as anybody shows any resistance towards a lot of them, you see how quickly they back down. What's really interesting is you see the juxtaposition in the protests. What I think is really interesting is you see a part of the protesters that come from neighborhoods that are really used to using violence, and they're very comfortable. They'll go in and they'll get violent with law enforcement. They'll get violent with other people. No problem there because they're used to using the tool of violence. Whereas the other protesters, who you can tell come from nicer neighborhoods, nicer backgrounds, they're usually at very nice colleges, but they like to put masks on and run around. This is not a political statement. This is me observing violence. Okay, you can tell who is good at violence and who is not good at violence. But what the people that I'm talking about, these people who are not good at violence, what are they really good at? They're good at posturing. And it's a real dangerous game. And every so often in the last year or so, you've seen times where that went horribly wrong for them, when people called them out and realized that they were just posturing. So what's my message? My message on this one is, again, it's back to understanding human interaction. Fight or flight for us is basically if we ran in and all of a sudden a tiger popped out of nowhere and we had a firearm, a firearm, and we were comfortable as hunters or whatever, we probably would engage that right away and we'd fight. We do that. Or, we'd flight, right away. It's just fight or flight. Why? It's a different species. It's not human on human. When it's human on human, you've got two other things you need to consider: capitulation, which is submission, and then posturing, which is the threat of violence with the hope that the other party is going to disengage because they feel the threat is credible. Extremely dangerous. So people have asked me questions that are variations of this. What do I do if, or what do I do? It's very simple. You don't want to have to use a tool of violence if you don't want to. Therefore, don't do anything that you're not willing to back up, because it can go horribly wrong for you, and you can bring it upon yourself in a much more vicious manner, because you never know who you're dealing with. I will say this one more time. I said it in another video that I did. When I'm out and about in the world, for the most part, people always tell me, "Oh my God, you're such a nice guy. You're this, you're that. You seem so cool." And I'll be around a lot of other alpha guys, and the first time they meet me, I don't try to out alpha anybody. In fact, I don't want them to think anything of me. If anything, they think, "Oh, he's just kind of a nice guy," and I don't really, talk too much about myself. I do that because I want them to have the ultimate advantage if I ever need to use a tool of violence. I don't want people to think I'm a threat. I don't want people to think I know much of anything. That's how I am. And I told you how I treat people. I treat most people, and it seems pretty extreme, but I treat most people like they're 6 seconds away from a shooting spree. Somebody I don't know. Therefore, how I'm going to interact with them, I'm going to interact very courteously. I'm not going to respond to their rudeness. It's not there. Again, I don't know the situation. I don't know who I'm dealing with. Therefore, why would I antagonize a situation that I don't have to antagonize? And I certainly wouldn't posture. It's extremely dangerous. So I'm looking forward to the feedback that I'm going to get from this, because I hope this message got across to you. Please let me know what you thought of this and any of your experiences. Have you ever known anybody that's used posturing and it's gone horribly wrong for them? Have you known anybody that's just completely capitulated? And, often that goes horribly wrong as well. And, have you known anybody that's used capitulation to get the threat closer so they can take action and fight? Those are my questions to you. Now, please subscribe. Please hit the notification button. Please make your comments. And please, please, please keep sharing this channel. Send this out to any of your friends that think, you think need, really great self-protection information. All the best.